much indeed for joining us. Warm welcome to you as well as we launch into this discussion on artificial intelligence and just how ready are we for it. I mean, it seems you can't turn around anywhere without seeing AI involved in one form or another. It's been called a game changer in so many different spheres, in boosting productivity, in minimizing waste, in increasing efficiency and transforming entire sectors like healthcare and education and trade. The list goes on. And it's not something that's out there. It's right here at our fingertips with Apple Siri and Google Assistant and Amazon Alexa. It's something that's touching all of our lives. However, it's also led to intense debates over ethics and safety. And generative AI technology in particular, such as ChatGPT, Bard, DALL-E, they've all raised legal and moral concerns because they're capable of generating new content, music, artwork, audio, video, and there are questions over copyright and plagiarism, as well as concerns over the accuracy of the data that these AI models are being trained on. And the fact that AI can create pretty perfect digital replicas of anyone or anything is one of the focuses of the ongoing strike in the US right now by writers and actors. So the aim of this session is to delve into the challenges and the opportunities of AI. How can we benefit but keep control of it? Who's accountable when things go wrong? How do we make sure that AI is used ethically and with integrity? And most importantly, how on earth do we keep up with a technology that's capable of learning and becoming more sophisticated? So these are some of the questions that we're going to be discussing with our panel, and we're very lucky to have some super speakers with us. I'm going to introduce them to you now. Going down the line, we have Wael William Diab, Business and Technology Strategist and Chair of the Joint ISO-IEC Standards Committee on Artificial Intelligence. Nicholas Davis, co-director of the Human Technology Institute at University of Technology Sydney, which focuses on putting humans at the centre of emerging technology. Dr. Kobe Lines, senior research fellow at King's College London, an expert for Standards Australia on AI governance. And joining us virtually, Peter Brown, senior advisor on technology policy at the European Parliament and editor of the ISO standard on AI governance. Just a couple of things to mention before we get started. You've probably heard me talk about this before. The brand new Unplugged Corner, which is the sort of little informal social area where you can meet speakers on panels throughout the day. Our AI experts have agreed to be there at 3:15 this afternoon. That's the area just outside the ballroom. If you need translation, several languages are available. You can use the Interprefy app. And interpretation also available on the online platform if you're joining us virtually. And there will be time for questions both online and in person. If you're online, please type that question into the Q&A box and it'll come to us. So we're going to start by setting the scene a little, giving a little bit of an overview. And I'm going to start with you, Wael, because you're immersed in the whole sort of infrastructure of AI and digital transformation. A lot of people very excited by AI, but equally a lot of people very concerned. In your view, what are the positives and negatives?
That's a great question. First of all, thank you for the opportunity to be here. And, you know, when we look at AI, I think AI is part of this trend now where technology is more and more embedded in our lives. I mean, the first thing I look at when I wake up in the morning is my smartphone. I look at my smartphone or smartwatch before I go to bed. And so I think these questions that are coming up are part of, you know, how we deal with technology that's so deeply integrated into our lives. And like anything else, I mean, as you very nicely framed it in the opening, there's going to be lots of benefits, but there's also issues that we need to keep our eyes open to. So let's look at some of the benefits that are happening. If you look, you know, we have this, we run this workshop twice a year, and one of the tracks that we look at is called Beneficial AI. And we've had presentations in terms of how AI can help reduce infant mortality, to how AI can actually save energy. Most people think of AI as being an energy hog, but you know, when you look at it, for example, applied in transportation, you can improve transportation routes, reduce overall energy consumption. And the list goes on. On the flip side, like any new technology, it's bringing up questions of privacy, security, more confidence in the fact that how these insights that AI will provide are going to be fair and unbiased. And so in order to tackle that, I think one of the changes that we're seeing, especially in the standards part of the equation, is we're dealing with these issues up front. So very inherent into our standards process is dealing with issues like ethics. So we're no longer just developing the technology and then thinking about how to make it more secure or how to make it more socially beneficial. We're doing this up front. And perhaps, I'm sure we're going to get into more of the details during the panel, but as an example, one of the things that we're doing is a management system standard that takes advantage of a very unique tool set that ISO offers in order to make AI certifiable and increase confidence in AI for the end consumers. And we're very much looking forward to that standard, which will be ISO IEC 42001 published towards the end of the year.
In terms of developments for AI, where do you see it going? I mean, what's the potential for AI in the future?
That's a great question. I mean, most marketing estimates that you look at, numbers and analysts, they have AI growing by a tremendous amount. If you look at the CAGR for AI, it's huge. And certainly, what we see from the standards world is one of the things that's really crucial is how we help enable sister committees in ISO and IEC that are working on verticals and domains of AI be able to develop roadmaps using the building blocks that SC42 is doing. And so when you look at it from that perspective, it's my belief that virtually every sector is going to have part of this digital transformation of industry is going to have some AI-enabled roadmap. So I think that's the very good news, and I think if we do our job correctly, then we can provide them with a tool set that inherently addresses some of the ethical issues as risk-based assessments and so on.
So when it comes to the risks and the impact on humanity, I don't want to get too dramatic here, but you've heard what people like Elon Musk are saying about AI as a threat to humanity. Do you believe that AI can be properly controlled and directed?
That's a great question. I mean, one of the things with emerging technology is that with the benefits, it brings potential risks. But from my perspective, I think, and just looking at it from the program of work that SC42 is working on, I mean, right at the beginning, one of the initial working groups that we set up is called trustworthiness, right? Right from the beginning, and I'm sure Peter is going to talk more about this, we had a joint project on governance of AI. We have also had ethics very tightly integrated into the program. So is there potential risk for any technology? Sure. But if we look at, automobiles when they were introduced over a century ago, there were lots of debates about whether or not these are going to be safe or not. And through the use of international standards and guidelines and frameworks, we have been able to put guardrails around it so that we can get the benefits without the downside. And I think this is what we're aiming to do with our program of work. So from my perspective, I am optimistic that we can do this challenge where we can get the benefit and address the downside and leverage international standards to get there.
You talked about building ethics into standards right from the start, from the beginning. Is that what we need to be mindful of when we are looking at how standards are developed? Is that one of your priorities?
Yeah, actually, it's not just my priority. It's the priority of all the countries that participate in SC42. So they've made it clear. And I think, people may, we in the standards world tend to be very careful around which words that we use. And sometimes, whether it's you say data privacy or you say ethics or you say social responsibility, at the end of the day, it's what tool sets are we providing to deal with that. So we have everything from, for example, work that looks at you want to get rid of unwanted bias in the system, all the way to ensuring data quality that is used by AI. As many people know, with AI, a lot of it depends on the data that it's looking at to be trained or the data during its operation. And so we have, for example, a multi-part series that looks at data quality for AI and machine learning. And so, yes, since the beginning, we've been looking at that. Even when we communicate with other sister committees to look at what their application looks like, we call it a use case. One of the novel things that we've done is we've added a question that says, what is your ethical concern? And so they will come back and say, it might be, on the privacy side. It may be on, what the action that the system might take. And we then translate that into a technical requirement and then leverage the standards that we're building to address it.
And just very briefly, Wael, how difficult is it to develop frameworks and standards around something that's changing so quickly?
That's a great question. I think it's certainly not easy, but one of the things that we've seen with SC42 that's unique is we've been fortunate to get a diversity in terms of our stakeholders. So first of all, it's not just countries that are predominantly producing the technology. We also have countries that are very interested in how the use of the technology is going to be. So that is unique from a ISO IEC perspective to offer that framework. Second of all, we have a diversity in the stakeholders that come into SC42. It's not just the engineers and the marketeers that are doing this. We have people from academia, we have social scientists, we have regulators. So this actually has made a difficult job easier because we can bring all of these views together and ultimately come up with a consensus-based standard that's more robust.
Well, thank you very much indeed for that. And before we just dive in, I've been most remiss in not introducing the fifth person on the stage in the corner there. This is Rachel. Rachel is scribing for us through the conversation, and she is converting comments and statements into fantastic images there. Thank you very much indeed, Rachel, and you'll see those appearing on the screen above you. So let's bring in the rest of the panel now. Nicholas, it's clear we're seeing a huge boom in AI companies, AI models. You can use AI to do almost anything. What are your thoughts on the benefits and risks and the need for regulation?
Yeah, thanks, Shirley. Well, it's great to be here, and I think we're really lucky to live at a critical moment in human history where through the standards community and across jurisdictions around the world, we're literally writing the rules and the legal infrastructure, the standards infrastructure that will take us around, for the next 10 to 20 years or so. And from my perspective, as someone who participates through to SC42, we have to remember that both the benefits and risks are really a matter of framing and choice. We can't fall into either of the two big traps around thinking about how technologies emerge. One trap is to look at technology as deterministic. It's just going to roll over us and there's all these risks that we just have to adapt to. But on the other hand, technologies like AI are not a simple tool. They shape us as we shape them, and they are the product of many hands and many sets of incentives and power structures throughout society. So all of this is really a matter of framing and, as Wael pointed out, of really context as well. So for me, I bring this back to, well, what benefits do we want to get out of these systems? And how do we frame that in a human-centred way through the use of things like governance and standards? So just as a quick example to build on Wael's example, when there's really no doubt in the minds of most of the members of the public around the world that there is a need for AI regulation, but there are many ways that you need to achieve that goal, and pulling on the lever of government and hard regulation is undoubtedly one of them. But what is underappreciated is many of those regulations already exist. So here in Australia, we have consumer protection law, we have privacy law, we have cybersecurity, we have negligence and tort law, so all of which applies.
Existing law.
Existing law is under-enforced and under-recognised by most players. Yes, we need to clarify. Yes, we need to update. And I think the key to unlocking a lot of that is the standards process and the acceptance of those within organisations.
Do you think the fact that we were quite slow in the beginning, but suddenly ChatGPT burst onto the scene, what was it, like a year ago, and now suddenly it's really focused minds on how to deal with that?
Look, 100%. That kind of compound annual growth rate that Wael mentioned is, close to 70 to 100% in generative AI, but that's because starting from a small base. There's been a change in the type of models that we use. So generative AI models are different from narrow AI. Narrow AI starts very specific and you work hard to make it generalizable in your business. Generative AI is the opposite. It starts really large and general, and you try and bound it down to the specifics of your problem. And that availability, the commercial and the open access to employees, many of whom are using them in your businesses without any knowledge of executives, has really raised a whole new set of opportunities and concerns.
Kobe, Nicholas was talking about existing laws, existing regulations being there in place. Are governments prepared adequately for, in terms of regulatory frameworks and governance, or are there gaps?
Yes to both of those questions, I think, is the short answer. And I have to confess that I'm going to agree furiously with Nick, and we have for some years been saying there is a lot of law that already applies. So for a long time there was a talk of not needing more law because AI has been around for a long time, although ChatGPT has expedited it. 1956 was the Dartmouth Conference. So a lot of AI is embedded not just in the things that we see, but more importantly in the things that we don't see. It sits behind a lot of the systems that we use. I think part of the issue that I see, and what I really love as a lawyer on the Standards Committee, is coming in and being able to do the translation work. So I think what a lot of people don't understand is that, you know, when one discipline says one thing, another discipline will say another thing, and one of those terms, for example, was ground truth. If you say ground truth to a layperson, they've got one definition, but if you talk to a data scientist, it's another. And I love, well, that you qualified that bias, you know, unwanted bias. You can't remove bias. Having worked in 2 computer science departments with computer scientists very, very closely, if you take bias out of an algorithm, it doesn't work. It's always preferencing something over another. So what are those preferences that are built into those systems that we want to have, and how do we have a language that's common that we can share to actually describe and make sure we're not talking past each other, which was part of the reason I became involved in the standards work as a non-computer scientist working in these computer science departments in universities, seeing that data scientists thought they were doing what the lawyers were asking, or what people from a governance perspective were asking, when in fact they were just talking straight past each other. I think what these standards do is provide a common language, and to answer your question more directly, I think a lot of those laws exist if lawyers were more creative, because it's not just the data scientists who speak past each other. The lawyers are also not thinking creatively enough about the laws that already exist. And they also need to engage more in the content of data science and understand the technology. So there's an interdisciplinary aspect that the language that the standards are creating, I think, is going to enable and foster both in government and also in corporations. Because to manage risk effectively, you can't work in silos the way that we have been working.
So we have to have a more coordinated response, a more smooth, integrated understanding of what it is that is trying
Correct.
to be achieved. And is that one of the major problems at the moment, that there is, as you were saying, these silos?
I think that's one of the major problems. The other major problem, which Nick has also highlighted, is this binary. I mean, I always say computer science is not binary, with a sort of tongue-in-cheek. That all technology, from the very first humans that were found next to a pile of rocks with a skull with no teeth, like all technology has been used to cause harm. All technology has been used to cause benefits. We choose. We get to choose what those guardrails are. And what I think is understood now with ChatGPT, which wasn't understood before by those outside of the field, is that you're already embedding governance in the systems you're building. So your choice of data set, your use of data, your connection of systems to each other is already a power. It's a form of governance. And so doing that thoughtfully and carefully, and particularly for SC42, in line with the risk appetite of a company, knowing that the board is getting what they think they're getting, and having everyone on board to answer questions and know what they're doing is absolutely critical to managing these risks.
Peter, the use of AI in the EU is going to be governed by the AI Act. Tell us about the AI Act. What does Europe want to achieve with that? What is Europe's approach to AI?
Thanks, Shirley. And firstly, thanks for having me on the panel. It's thanks to several thousand international standards that I'm able to join you remotely and from the other side of the planet in the middle of the night here. Firstly, when we talk about Europe, we've got to be clear. There's a distinction between what the European Union does as a political entity, what its individual member states may want to do, what the European Commission as our executive wants to do, and what we as a Parliament, as the legislative arm, want to do. But I think when the Commission proposal dropped just over a year and a half ago, it was clear that the core objective was to ensure that AI systems placed on the market in the European Union and used in the European Union are safe and respect existing laws on fundamental rights and on privacy. And I think that echoes a bit the two previous points about there are laws in place already. It's a question of just bringing them up to date and being able to apply them to AI. I think the main themes of the European Union's approach so far, and certainly in the Commission's initial proposal and supported by the European Parliament, was that we needed a general AI regulation. Many countries, many states, many subnational political entities around the world have sector-specific regulation already at AI, whether it's in field of medical devices or the use in medicine, in policing, in public space, management of just public spaces and so on. But the European approach was to say we want a human-centered, sustainable, safe, ethical, and trustworthy use of AI in the European Union. What the legislation has done is tried to break our concerns into three categories. Firstly, to say where there is a red line, that there are certain things that we will not allow onto the European Union market. That includes, a ban on any product or service which is deliberately intended for deceptive use or to deceive either citizens or consumers, to outlaw any system of social scoring or social ranking, issues like banning remote real-time biometric identification in a sort of generalized sense, and the sort of scary aspect of sort of things like predictive policing. So there was a very clear batch of areas where both the European Commission and the European Parliament said these are areas which we just feel should not be on the market. The rest is then divided up by a sort of what we call a sort of harmonized risk-based approach, where we say there are certain categories of AI use which are higher risk than others, and those higher ones require that organizations placing on the market AI products are duty-bound to put into place certain guide rails, controls, certifications, and whatever to ensure that the use of those AI in those higher risk areas, whether that's in medicine, in critical national infrastructure, protection of national services, and things like that, that these areas of use of AI are regulated according to application of available standards, certification by bodies that they conform to that, and recourse to citizens and to businesses if companies don't respect that. And then there's the lower risk areas where you're sort of saying, look, the reality is there are low risk uses of AI, and many of them, surely even in your introductory remarks, you mentioned that a lot of services are out there already, and we've tried to bound those there. A final point, which, and this was more by luck than by design in terms of the timing, when the original proposal for the legislation came to the European Parliament from the European Commission, it was just at the time that ChatGPT and generative AI started to become a big topical issue. So I think the Parliament's done itself proud in responding very elegantly to that new challenge, and actually recognizing that a lot of work you do, and I think Well hinted at that as well in his remarks, sometimes you need standards or regulation that have a sort of high-level, light-touch approach, which can be adapted according to new technologies, new methods, new techniques coming into place, because you're focusing on outcomes, you're focusing on risk, on harms, you're focusing on opportunities, you're focusing on organizations' responsibilities. So I was very happy with that, particularly as being the editor of the standard on governance and the use of AI and governance implications of that, because the focus was very much to say, look, this shouldn't be a brittle, very detailed standard that tells you must do A, B, C. It rather lays out general principles. And I think the way the Parliament has responded has been to take that on board with the whole area of generative AI.
Peter, thank you. So talking there about how standards and governance over the use of AI, Nicholas, when it comes to issues of transparency and accountability, do standards help us there? Does that help instill trust in AI by people?
Yeah, absolutely. So if you were to look at or participate in any of those conversations around the AI management standard, or indeed the impact assessment standard and others in development, transparency is very clearly one of the principles and an outcome that is obviously not always a final outcome. The reason you want transparency in these systems is to have the accountability to be able to seek redress and get the information that you would need as a consumer or group or individual who's affected by these systems. Now, transparency is not always easy to obtain, particularly if we think about the long value chain of certain machine learning algorithms and AI products. You might have, a researcher that designs the system and does some initial training, and then you might have someone else that takes that from an open source repository, trains it on some different data, gets packaged up, and along the way you have lots of incentives to maybe say, look, this is commercial in confidence, this is really part of our secret sauce, I don't want to open it up. So being able to create standards around what should be transparent and where, how to treat third-party engagement in circumstances where you need to have that certification, being able to clearly have standards, like Wael said, on data quality, where you can have the assurance, or at least that sense that you're in conformance with some of those inputs, is actually all critical to that outcome of being able to be transparent. Where I spend a lot of my time is making sure at the organisational level, what does that actually look like? What does that obligation from a governance standpoint mean for an organisation? And currently there are quite a lot of difficult conversations with vendors because you are actually having to look back into your contracts and procurement to be able to find new ways to have that transparency to your end users if you're working with a technology partner.
Yeah, I think this is a really important question because there's a lot of concern over how AI and AI algorithms are being used, and is what is being produced, is that being produced by AI or by a real person? Kobe, is that something international standards can help with? How do they underpin governance, and how does that work with generative AI?
Absolutely. For generative AI, I think generative AI was the trigger, but a lot of corporations are already using automated systems. And I think it's worth mentioning that you don't actually need to use AI for a lot of these risks to occur. Simple automation, which some of us have seen many examples of this already, can cause harm. So whenever a company is using a form of automation or AI, what I have conversations with, the conversations I'm having on a regular basis with board members are, how do we manage that? What should our risk appetite be? How do we frame that? How do we place that in a commercial context, not just with what we're building, but when we have a vendor coming to us, how do we know whether we should buy their product or not? How do we question them in terms of what they've built in? To your point, you start out with a system, it evolves, it's changed over time. What are the values inherent in those systems that you're purchasing? And having worked in corporates doing this work, I know exactly how hard it is. Firstly, there are sales pitches that are not legitimate and don't necessarily reflect what the system is. There's not data literacy in a lot of corporations to ask the right questions. And I think this standard is going to be a game changer, not just for the companies that sign on to the standard, because obviously not everyone will, but it's going to lift the game. I think that it will change the expectations not only for the companies themselves, but for third-party providers, because I don't think people are aware of how many of these technologies sit behind and stack in any device or any corporate. There is barely a corporate anymore that runs alone on its own data and its own systems. Everybody's reliant on an ecosystem, and I think this will change that game.
Wael, can you comment to that as well? When it comes to developing standards for AI, you were talking about factors like ethics and integrity. Can you expand on that and how that can be built in at an early start?
Yeah, actually, I mean, the conversation has been fantastic. Just perhaps I'll do that by building on what some of the concepts that were already mentioned, like Kobe was talking about, people talking in different languages, right? One of the standards that we published last year, ISO IEC 22989, is all about terminology and concepts. And actually, ISO and IEC have made that freely available. So anyone that wants to kind of dip their toe in understanding some of the work that we do can go on and download ISO IEC 22989. It's a great way to get started. The other thing is we often forget that AI is part of IT. And there's a tremendous amount of infrastructure of standards that have been produced over the years to deal with IT and IT issues. So one of the philosophies that we take is to look at what already exists and then build upon it. So for example, the governance standard that Peter talked about, that is actually part of a series that SC40 had produced, and we jointly worked with them to be able to produce that. I think as we talked a lot about applications in different verticals and domains. If I look at SC42's program of work, most of our work tended to be in direct working groups that were very horizontal. Over the last few years, we have been setting up these joint working groups. So basically working with ISO TC215 on health informatics, working with IEC SC65A on safety and AI systems, working with SC7 on testing of AI-based systems. So it's this idea that we look at the whole ecosystem. We start with, what are the IT standards that exist today? And then we look at, what are the gaps that exist? In some cases, we come up with novel approaches like 42001. In other cases, we partner up and fill these gaps. And along the way, early on, you asked about ethics. Early on, we had to make a decision within the committee. How do we deal with ethics? Do we want to have just an ethics working group? And it turns out that actually doesn't really work. So we have a couple of dedicated projects on ethics that really tie everything together. But the guidance that we had issued into the committee was, you need to consider ethics across all of your program of work. So whenever you're thinking about anything, ethics is part of it, whether it's the governance standards, whether it's in the use cases, whether it's in the application guidelines. And I think it's just a little different way to think about how technology standards are developed from what we have been used to. But I think, so for example, you talked about transparency, right? I mean, we have a whole list from when we set up the committee of issues that have come up. Transparency, explainability is another one, right? Bias. And then we go through them and we see, here is what might already exist in terms of the infrastructure standards that people are used to. We can either, in some cases, extend it to deal with AI-specific stuff, or if needed, then we start something new.
Okay. Peter, I want to just build on that with you, because obviously
Sure.
we've talked about SC42 and 40. Do you think there needs to be a global coordinated response when it comes to dealing with AI? And what do you see the future challenges for that?
Well, having listened to the UN General Secretary this morning, Antonio Guterres, I'm not that optimistic. He was rather cautious about coordinated global response to the biggest threat to humanity at the moment, climate change. And if we can't do it on that, I think he's reading between the lines. His message was we may have even more difficulty elsewhere. Coordinated global response, probably not. But, and I think this is an important issue, if we're going to avoid talking past each other as legislators in different countries, in businesses, in consumer groups or whatever, you've got to start, and I think the other speakers, Kobe and Wael particularly, have hinted at this, you've got to start with a common understanding of what you're talking about. I tend to be a bit of a minimalist when it comes to AI. I would say about 80% of what's out there calling themselves AI is all hype. It's not. It's just very fast, very greedy programming and data use and number crunching. There's nothing really innovative about it. It's people are jumping on the bandwagon because it's a popular area.
Isn't it the fact that
even
some AI models are capable of learning? I think that's what is worrying some people.
Well, exactly, and I think this is what and the reason. I mean, it sounds. I mean, Wael hinted at that, and we've both been through that. When the time that we took to develop a core standard on core definitions and concepts of AI, the reason that took so long was because at the end of the day, what we've ended up with is a common grounded understanding of what these things are about. So that when we talk about a neural network or a machine learning system or deep learning and all of these things that are being thrown around by consultants left and right, that we actually sort of start nailing these down and sort of saying, okay, if we agree that we're both talking about this, then we can actually start talking and start cooperating. And I think a classic example of that, I see that in my own work in the European Parliament, is the EU-US Trade and Technology Council, which has had cooperation on AI very high on its agenda. Very early on in Parliament's consideration of the AI Act, we agreed with NIST, the National Institute of Standards and Technology in the US, to both use the OECD guiding principles on ethical AI as a baseline, because we thought if it's been defined somewhere else and it's useful, let's use it. Let's not start going off at a tangent and sort of reinventing the wheel. So this issue of terminology being basis for good cooperation, I think, is absolutely essential. It's a prerequisite, but it's obviously not enough. But the other thing I would say is we should be careful of seeing standards as either an alternative to regulation or an alternative to business cooperation and business agreements. Again, I would say it's an underpinning of both. I think the prospects for cooperation globally are very, very good. A coordinated response or a sort of harmonized response, I don't think is going to happen. But that's not a problem. We see that in the global marketplace anyway. The fact that you can trade certain goods in one country, in one area, and export them to others is done on the basis that we understand that different entities, different economies are good at producing or consuming different types of things. And so that global trade also in AI services, I think, will happen. But if it's done on a basis that we're clearly understanding what we're talking about, then I think that sort of cooperation can improve indeed.
I want to ask all of you, we did a panel on cybersecurity first thing this morning, and one of the things that one of the speakers said was that standards don't move fast enough, the development of standards don't move fast enough to keep up with the technology that is changing so quickly, right? So I wondered what you had to say about that. Kobe, what's your view on the speed of standards development?
I think that one of the things that's overlooked in standards that's really important is social license. It's not just the output that's important, it's the process. It's much like a lot of the international agreements, which as an outsider, people look inside and say, why is it so slow? Why is it so hard? Why do you sit there fighting over words? The meetings can be so boring. As one of our colleagues described them as Vorgon poetry for those who've read Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. Why this is necessary is because you're actually building community and you're actually building international buy-in. If you rush standards and you don't have the right people in the room, this goes with any kind of agreement, you're not going to have effective standards. And I actually worry about standards that are created too quickly. I'm not saying we should do them, painfully slowly, but international negotiation takes time. My first career was at the UN, sitting and negotiating various treaties. You cannot have international treaties that happen in a hurry, and it's the same for standards. I think that it's really important to remember that the quality of those standards is really important, and having the right people in the room, not just states, but as well as highlighted, interdisciplinary groups who speak to each other. Translation work, which has basically been my whole career, takes time. We're translating across languages, but we're also translating across cultures. We all engage differently. Finding ways that are respectful and meaningful is really, really important. The final point would be, I don't think the standards should be text specific, and I think we agree furiously on this, that if you're talking about managing risks with AI, there are different applications that will raise different risks, but actually we don't need a new standard for every new technology. A lot of what we're doing is already building on existing standards. So better to do it properly and actually build out a proper toolkit. To your point, Peter, it's not the only thing, it doesn't replace regulation, but there's a whole toolkit available, and we want to make sure we get those tools sharpened and right and ready for each particular purpose that they're meant for.
Nicholas, do you have a view?
Yeah, I'd probably even take this a little bit further and say there's actually a really dangerous myth that's been propagated, I won't say by who, but propagated, which goes something along the lines of technology just moves far too quickly for regulators to ever keep up. Government just doesn't have what it takes to be able to come to this, and standards processes are too slow, so why do we even bother? So there's two things about that, and the first one is, as Peter and Kobe have pointed out very ably, quality takes time. You need to have the opportunity to navigate the different perspectives, and you have to have the diversity as well. But the second concern that I have here is we are systematically underinvesting in regulatory processes, in the ability to consult, to engage and bring people together. So anyone who says, standards and regulation and these co-regulation things take too long, I'd point out that the government departments that I work with here in Australia that are making policy are operating on a shoestring, and yet they are working on incredibly important underpinnings of our legal and rights environment that we need to get right. So really bringing this idea forward of this is a choice how much we want to invest in these guardrails, and a choice how we want to apply these instruments that are coming out of standards as well.
Peter, do you want to
Surely,
add to
if I
that?
may.
Sure.
Yeah, just I think the important thing is that you need to develop standards at the right pace. I mean, there are certain standards which are very technical, very detailed, very specific. I mean, I'm a musician. If the 6.35 millimeter jack is not 6.35 millimeter, I'm not going to make a connection and make a sound. So some technical standards have to be very, very specific, and they take time to do that. I think the best standards are those ones which are very, very precise, detailed, and have a specific function, and those at the other end which are very, not vague, but very broad in their application and stand the test of time. And I think it's finding the right combination of those. And I think SC42 is I think an exemplar of that in the world of ISO work, because you've got some areas of very detailed technical work going on, and at the same time looking at those bigger, broader policy issues, which are flexible enough and focusing on outcomes and harms and opportunities, rather than very, very specific issues which could be very brittle, very fragile if they break.
Sure. Yes. Brief comment.
So I think it's a three-legged stool, right? There's the quality of the standards that you want to maintain, which I think when you look at the ISO system is very robust in terms of how the voting happens. The second is the execution of the process, and that's something that's constantly looked at, how we can speed this up. But I think the third leg, which is what you've heard the panel hint at, we don't know what we don't know. And part of what takes time is to identify the problems. And I think what we've tried to do within SC42 is use a variety of tools to bring in outside stakeholders, look at what some of the emerging requirements are and how to address them. And I think that piece of it is overlooked because people try to, if I have to start right here, how quickly can I produce something? But really, it's much earlier on to identify what the problems are. The second point I would make, which is very quick, I think, is it The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy? The answer to everything is 42.
Yeah.
So.
SC42, there you go.
Yes, but that was shown to be based on a erroneous premise from the start. But we won't get into the the plot lines of Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, which I do know very well. Guys, thank you very much indeed. We're going to take questions from the floor. I'm going to start with one that's coming to us online, and this is a question about data accuracy that we were talking about earlier. An ongoing debate on data ownership. Information available on the internet is being scraped and used for training this AI technology. Do you think standardization on harnessing information will help preserve the authenticity of information being shared through AI tech? So should we be looking at regulation on what kind of data is being fed into AI models? Anyone want to take that one?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, we should, is the short answer. We need to be very mindful of the fact that what's presented online is not necessarily intended to be put together in the ways that it is. And although the lens right now is on intellectual property, I think there are broader questions of identity. I had a very interesting conversation with someone at a whiskey bar last night about this for hours. How much do we admit or do we consent to having put together about us? It's very different if I put up a blurb about myself online, but when that's linked to my medical data and where I've been for my holidays, and I don't have a particularly active social media life, is that what I want? Is that compliant with GDPR? I think we're going to see some interesting things coming down the pipeline in terms of what's used and how it's used. We're not there yet. The focus is very much on IP, but there are broader questions. To your point, there are also questions of funding. So I think one of the things that we're not talking about is when we replace people and are more efficient, who's paying the taxes? Who funds the governments? Who pays for the roads? What is the society we're building? And this is something that we can't answer in a standard, but there are some really big questions around the data and how we're using it. And is it what we want for society? I think they're questions that are going to come up further down the road. We're not necessarily talking about them enough now, but they're coming.
Should we take a
I
question
think the European
from...
Union... Oh, sorry. Go
Ahead, Peter, if you want to make a comment.
No, it was just to say that this issue is very explicitly been addressed by the European Parliament's amendments to the AI Act to ensure that for generative AI there is a compliance with transparency requirements, disclosing that content was AI generated, for example, distinguishing deep fake from real ones, and it also ensuring safeguards against generating illegal content, but also the detailed summaries of copyrighted data used for training purposes would need to be publicly available. I think that's quite it's a pain point for a lot of the producers of AI systems there, but it's core to the sort of transparency and fundamental rights principles of the EU to say we have, as citizens, a right to know how you come to make certain decisions. So it's a combination of transparency and knowing where the data's come from.
I'd just like to say that I asked ChatGPT to write a bio for myself. Apparently I've won the Pulitzer Prize twice and have written a fantastic BAFTA award-winning novel. I like that. I'm going to use that as my bio from now on. But it does show that, you know, AI has got a little way to go, or at least the current models of it have got a little way to go. Do we have a question from the audience? Gentleman in the row there. Can I ask you to stand up, and when the microphone comes to you, if you just say your name and your organisation and who your question is for.
I'm Khalid Soufi from EOS Egypt. I just want to build on what Peter said, that there should be a red line, because fast learning machine is somehow have a beneficial side and very dangerous side. So what can we do? Can we create some kind of standard that puts this red line?
Keeping the red line in place, Peter, how do we do that?
I mean, the draft act that we have provides for a sort of oversight board and what the European Parliament is calling an AI office, and the objective there is precisely like you see in lots of legislation. You have secondary and implementing measures and powers. The objective there is to have an oversight board brought together, which brings together both AI experts as well as members from national regulatory bodies to be able to answer those questions, to be able to sort of say, okay, does this new thing that's come onto the market cross the red lines that we've established for certain outlawed technologies, or is it something that should be placed in the high risk category? And I think the recognition that it's not a once and done piece of legislation, but that it needs to adapt to the reality of something which is very fast pacing, was behind that push to have that office established.
Can I add something to that?
Sure.
I think one of the things, I mean, Peter is answering from the regulatory side. I think one of the things that we're learning is, you know, AI just doesn't operate in vacuum, right? I mean, AI is going to be part of an application domain. So this is where it's crucial that what we design in SC42 is horizontal and can be basically dialed in terms of, you know, the risk. What then needs to happen is that needs to be done in partnership with the committees that are actually addressing that domain, because they have the experts there, they have the infrastructure, they work with the regulators on that side as well, taking what we build from like the IT perspective and dialing it in. So it's not, if you put AI in a smart factory, it's not operating in vacuum. I mean, it's part of their system, you know, like any other piece of IT, there'll be some redundancy, there'll be controls in place, and every application is a little bit different. And I think when we keep that in mind is, you know, if we are drawing lines around this, these lines have to be based on the application and the use case.
Sure. I'll take another question from our online audience. What are the consequences for countries that are not able to adapt to AI advancements? Is that a concern of what's happening in other countries? Do you want to take that, Nicholas?
Yeah, sure. There's two ways to view that issue, really. One angle here is that there is obviously a risk when an economy is not able to grasp all the opportunities that Wael outlined at the beginning of this session. You need a certain set of digital infrastructure, skills infrastructure, access to networks, and you are probably, many countries, Australia included, rely on overseas cloud computing infrastructure. We don't have enough compute here onshore to run the lives that we enjoy for those of you who live in Australia. So part of this question is making sure you've got those kind of that infrastructure and those ability to grasp the opportunities. The other end of this spectrum is, and from a standards perspective, is around building public trust and social license with your citizens and your consumers to be able to say, no, the products and services we're offering and we're embedding in our health system or in transport or in our in our phones, all of these are well managed, trustworthy, protected, and upholding any fundamental rights as they pertain to that country. So making sure you get this right from the national perspective on both sides of this, I think, is critical. And more as acts like the EU's AI Act come in, there will also be extraterritorial impact of these in the sense of needing to be interoperable and come up to standard in order for your companies and your citizens to be able to work and enjoy the benefits of those products and companies overseas.
Do you want to add to that, Cobe?
I'm going to sound like a lawyer, but I think the answer to your question is it depends. It depends on the world that we're envisioning. So the technologies that are developing now can be used to bring other countries along with us, or they can leave them further behind. And I think that's a choice that we're making. And by setting these standards, we can hopefully have the interoperable interactivity that we actually need. And I hope that we would be building the world in a way that facilitates that. But I think, you know, to Peter's point as well, the environmental impact is something we can't overlook. We really need to be thinking carefully, and this is in all the work that I do. I always start with, what's your problem statement? What is the problem you're trying to solve for? Because you don't need to go back to the toolbox analogy. You don't need an enormous cudgel if you're trying to kill an ant. You really just need to think, what is the thing that's the most suited for this? And part of SC42 actually addresses that from a risk perspective. We are building more data centres and using more water, and to your point, like, this is going to exponentially increase at the same time that we're hitting the pointy end of a climate crisis that's not going away. How do those two things interact? We've also got environmental carbon standards. The final point I was going to make is, we keep talking about AI like it's a singular, separate thing. The most complicated review I've done internally was actually of a chatbot that sits on another service, on a social media platform, on something else, and they all interoperate. And we had to review and think about, how do we manage risk in that circumstance? One piece of that changes and the whole risk profile changes. So if you think about these systems, also thinking about them in systems, not as an individual, here's an AI on my phone, but you know, your bank loan has multiple AI pieces that are being used to generate your bank loan. If you're using health data, or your doctor is coming to some kind of diagnosis and they're using any AI-assisted tool, again, you're having platforms that are welded together. So to Peter's point, we don't want those to be brittle, we don't want those to be out of date. We also don't want them to be biased. A lot of the medical data is, you know, really biased in terms of who they're looking at and who they're trying to keep healthy. So that also goes to your point of equality. Those data sets from the outset need to be inclusive. And if you just wanted a very clear example of this, go and look at the Volvo ad of the data that was used for crash test dummies that were built on male body types and the number of women who died in car crashes because women were just not considered in car accidents. So that's a really simple example, but you multiply that across systems and they're the kinds of harms that we're thinking about. And that goes to your global question of who's in the data, who's reflected, who are we thinking about? It's really important.
Okay, another question from the floor. Lady in the row here. Thank you. Yeah, if you can just stand up and a microphone will come to you. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much for an interesting presentation. I just wanted to ask you, I'm involved in two technical committees, Human Resources Management and Aging Societies. Now with the Human Resources Management one, we've actually been talking about, there's a group of people that say we need to think about what AI means in the human resources management space and standards. And then we have other people that are saying in a technical committee, who are the software engineers, I must admit, who say, no, you don't have to think about it because it's already dealt with somewhere else. So I think my question is, what do you recommend for technical committees that are more in the social services space, like aging societies, where we obviously have our problems that we need to solve, but we're not sure what the AI issue is. In human resource management, I think it is clear, but other people have different opinions. So we've made a liaison request with you, with SC42 last week, but I'm just wondering what are your recommendations for us to discuss the impact in technical committees that are more going the other way? Thank you.
More social-based, more care-based. Who wants to take that? Please.
I think it sounded like, and I'm sorry, the audio quality was, it sounded like the technical committee's already submitted the liaison with SC42, is that correct? So I think one of the things that we can do, which is, and I completely understand the dilemma, right? Because it's a new thing, you know, you come into SC42 and there's a whole host of standards and work that's going on. So we have a very nice overview slide where typically we'll work with the liaison officers and the leadership of the other committee and just kind of sit down and look to see where is a good place to start. The other tool set that we have, which I mentioned earlier, we have a workshop series that we archive and really helps kind of look in at some of the points. So my quick answer to that is it sounds like perhaps we have a little bit of homework to do offline to connect with your committee and then make sure that, take a look at what your needs are and perhaps even take a use case from your committee and add it to our database, as well as see how we can help you.
Thank you. Thank you for the question. I'll take one last question from our online audience. This is about standards or regulations. How do we decide whether we need a standard or a regulation to deal with some of the issues discussed? And I'll go one further and say there is talk of should there be a single dedicated body that oversees AI. So what direction should we be going in? Peter, do you have a view on standards, regulations, dedicated bodies?
Leave standardization to the standards experts, leave regulation to the publicly elected officials who are there to do the job of regulating. That's the pat answer. The reality is more complex, and I think it is this interplay. And I think the more that regulators are exposed to what standards can do and how standards can help them come up with better regulation, and maybe not go as far as they were initially planning because they realized that there are standards out there and it may be easier just to say, look, as long as you conform and can prove through certification and compliance testing that you do what you say you're going to do on the box, we're good enough with that. We don't need to legislate any further. And of course, that also comes down to the nature or the type of legislature you have. I mean, the US tends to be much more driven by things like the bodies like the Federal Trade Commission, who sort of say, literally, do what you say you're going to do on the box, as long as it's not totally illegal and it's not going to kill anybody. If you do what you say you're going to do on the box, you will be held to a lower level of liability than if your product does something which isn't described well on the box. And how you describe things on the box is what the role of standards is to be able to, again, disambiguate key terms, be very precise in the terminology being used, and saying this product or this service will do this, it will not do this, and leaving it either to litigation, intervention by regulatory agencies like FTC, or which has tended to be a more European approach, which is sort of more, we have what's called the precautionary principle, where we sort of say if we're not convinced that this is entirely safe to go on the market, then yes, we will lay down very clear guidelines and guardrails and red lines in terms of what can and cannot be done.
Yeah, it's an interesting question because lots of countries are considering legislation right now, aren't they, including the US. What do you want to say, Nicholas?
I guess one point that I would say is that regulators have a particular role to play in setting the outcomes and the desired outcomes, and in particular choosing how to prioritise those outcomes where there are trade-offs between rights. So the right to privacy in relation to our desire for secure society and the need for certain forms of surveillance, or the desire from governments for certain forms of surveillance, is a threshold question that differs. Once you've set that in regulation and you've managed to say, well, here's the balance that we think for our particular society, for our however you set that, the next question is, well, how do we implement and show compliance? And there actually regulating that standards are a vehicle for that is a way where a lot of legislation around the world actually operates, and it's fantastic because then you immediately get that interoperability by adopting and using an international standard. So that solves many of the problems, even though the threshold level is obviously determined by those processes at the country level.
I think this is a subject that we could carry on talking about for quite a bit longer, but I'm aware of the time and I know that we do have to break for lunch. If you do have other questions that you want to ask our speakers, don't forget they will be available in the unplugged corner, which is the soft seating area outside the main ballroom. So I know that some of you still have questions you want to ask. Do please go and have an informal chat with our panelists from 3:15 this afternoon. And I also want to let you know that if anyone in the technical community does want to find out more, there are ISO IEC workshops on AI, which are held online twice a year. You can talk to YL about that or talk to ISO about that and get involved more practically. Thank you very much indeed for your questions, both here in the audience and online. And please give a final round of applause for our wonderful speakers.
And thank you to you for a great job moderating.
Thank you. Okay, time for lunch, everyone. See you after.